Hello and welcome to today's program, U.S. Korea Summit Analysis. I'm Tom Byrne, President and CEO of the Korea Society. I hope this session provides you with insights and perspective from three renowned speakers so that we can better understand the first summit meeting between South Korean President Moon Jae-in and U.S. President Joseph Biden. The leaders' joint statement and press conference last Friday evening covered a lot of ground. This session will primarily focus on the U.S. ROK Alliance, diplomacy, geostrategic issues, North Korea, and the COVID-19 pandemic and vaccine diplomacy. Today's speakers bring a wealth of experience, expertise, and authority to address these issues. It's my pleasure to introduce them. First up, General Vincent K. Brooks, a career Army officer who recently retired from active duty as the four-star general in command of all U.S. forces in Korea, where he concurrently commanded United Nations Command as well as the Republic of Korea U.S. Combined Forces Command, comprising over 600,000 Koreans and Americans under arms. We've had the good fortune to invite General Brooks to a number of Korea Society functions, including our policy programs, Kim Koo Professional Series roundtables, and notably, General Brooks was the keynote speaker at our 2019 annual dinner. Next up is Ambassador Chris Hill. Ambassador Hill is a former career diplomat, a four-time ambassador, nominated by three presidents, whose last post was as ambassador to Iraq from April 2009 until August 2010. Prior to Iraq, Hill served as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs from 2005 until 2009, during which he was also the head of the U.S. delegation to the six-party talks on the North Korean nuclear issue. Earlier, he was the U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Korea. Ambassador Hill is now the George W. Ball Adjunct Professor at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. He is also on the board of the Korea Society, and we are delighted to have his comments today. And last up is Dr. Peter J. Hotez, the Dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine. Dr. Hotez is an internationally recognized physician scientist in tropical diseases and vaccine development. As head of the Texas Children's Hospital, he leads a team that develops new vaccines for hookworm infection, schistosomiasis, leishmaniasis, Chagas disease, and the SARS, MERS, SARS-2 coronaviruses. He is a champion of global access to vaccines, and so we are also delighted to have his views presented today as well.
Well, thanks so much for the opportunity to provide a comment after the most recent summit. My first observation is that the summit was successful on many different levels. I think first, it reaffirmed a strong alliance relationship. And honestly, it was good to see mutual respect on display. It affirmed the shared view of the alliance as the linchpin for security and prosperity. I was glad to see those words continued and in good strength. And I found it reassuring that the security relationship actually takes first place in the description of the new chapter of the alliance. There were several commitments that were made to the defense of the Republic of Korea and maintaining a strong combined defense posture under the existing mutual defense treaty. That was encouraging to hear. And also to provide extended deterrence using the full range of U.S. capabilities. And that should be a welcome statement for those who are seeking reassurance of a continued U.S. commitment. And there was also emphasis on denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And I think the word choice here is important because it actually aligns with North Korea's word choice, as opposed to the denuclearization of North Korea, as has been said in some cases before. I actually view this as an important signal to North Korea, and the message is that the alliance hears them. And that may make the opportunity for dialogue better than it might have been otherwise. I think also there was a reiteration of the firm commitment to a conditions-based transition of wartime operational control. That firm commitment to conditions-based essentially closes the door on an acceleration of having OPCON transition occur in the final year of President Moon's administration. I was very surprised to see the elimination of the revised missile guidelines. These are mutually agreed guidelines on limiting the range and the payload of any missile systems that that South Korea develops. The termination is a significant step. This removes any agreed restrictions on the development of missile technology by South Korea. And that previous agreement on limitations to range and payload has adjusted a few times, even during my time in command over there in 2018. But this is the complete removal of any restrictions, and it thus gives a sense of full sovereignty to South Korea, particularly the way it was done, where the reflection is about consultation with the United States and then a South Korean decision to eliminate these restrictions. It also fundamentally opens the door to South Korean missile developments to ranges beyond the Korean Peninsula. And I think this is very important to recognize. And that also grants them an unlimited conventional payload. So this includes the ability to operate in space. This is, I think, a very important change that may not get much in the way of focused discussion, but in my perspective, it was one of the most significant outcomes of this particular summit. I believe, honestly, that particular outcome will be one to watch, to see how South Korea portrays itself to the rest of the world, and especially to China, Russia, and Japan, which are the first countries residing beyond the current range limitations. The U.S. commitment to establish a comprehensive Korea-U.S. Global vaccine partnership was also very important. And while that may be discussed by some of the other colleagues today, I want to highlight the specific provision of vaccines to the 550,000 or so South Korean armed forces. That, to me, was an expression of a major commitment that should be well received within the alliance. And while it may be short of what some in South Korea were hoping for, which is a sufficient number of vaccines for the entire South Korean population, it was an affirmation of reciprocity, and also an affirmation of the important spirit of we go together, or 같이 갑시다, which was formed principally through the military bonds between the two countries' armed forces. In all, I believe the summit to have been an excellent success. And I think the alliance emerged stronger than before the summit, and that there's good momentum for actions that will define the final year of President Moon, and that will likely carry over into the next term, regardless of the party elected, because of the nature of what was chosen here. And it will also very clearly set the direction for the first year of President Biden's policies regarding Korea. So thank you very much. Those are my thoughts, and I appreciate the opportunity to comment.
Well, welcome, Ambassador Hill.
Thank you very much.
The Leaders Summit statement covered a lot of ground: the U.S. Korea Alliance, diplomacy towards North Korea, regional geostrategic issues, including the Quad and Taiwan, climate goals, coordinated responses to the pandemic, Korean investment in the U.S., and cooperation in commercial space exploration even. Given all that, what do you think of the highlights? And was there any new ground reached, or were there any omissions in the joint statement?
Well, first of all, I think the summit went very, very well. You know, a lot of summits, they always start off with grandiose plans, and then you're just lucky you get through it without some kind of problem. This went really well, and I think both sides got a lot out of this. You can imagine for President Biden, after a week of dealing with the Middle East, what a pleasure it must have been to talk to a Korean ally and talk about issues that we're mutually interested in. I think from the U.S. perspective, we have an ally that is clearly a good ally, works with us, listens to us, doesn't surprise us, understands the value of the military presence, all of that. I think President Moon made a great impression on President Biden. Secondly, I think from the Korean perspective, it was really good. There was some effort to deal with COVID vaccinations together, and I thought that was pretty compelling thing that they did with making doses available for basically all of the Korean armed forces.
That's right.
So that was obviously well received in Korea, which is perhaps had a supply problem on the COVID situation, whereas to some extent the U.S. is having a demand problem on it. So I think it was pretty good cooperation. The Koreans wanted to see that the Biden administration really cares and is moving on this North Korean issue. And it's not that anyone has some brilliant new idea for how to deal with it, but certainly the Koreans did not want it to get studied to death in Washington, which usually when you study things in Washington, it doesn't mean anything is going to happen. So I think the Koreans were very pleased that this administration really means business, and I think moving ahead of that was very important to them. And then, of course, and I suspect there was a lot going on behind the closed doors during the actual summit, but it came out in the press conference as well. The issue of the regional architecture, the Quad. Korea has been having this question: should it be in? Should it be out? If not one of those two outcomes, should it be something in between that is participating in working groups, et cetera? So I think there was a sense that there's some open architecture and certainly room for Korea. And finally, a bit of a surprise to a lot of people, of course, was the decision to allow Korea, from the U.S. perspective, to allow Korea to develop whatever missiles it wants to develop.
Right.
This will be interesting. Will the Koreans want to go in outer space? Will they want more military weapons? So it's essentially going to be up to the Koreans. So I think all in all, it was pretty successful from both sides. These issues with Korea, it's no longer let's just sit and talk about the Korean peninsula. It's about talking about issues of mutual interest, and the Koreans have a worldwide perspective on this.
Right. Yeah, I think it was President Moon in the press conference. He complimented the Americans on completing the policy review to North Korea so quickly. Not being a diplomat, I was thinking, well, what took it so long?
You're right. It took several months, and that may be an example of Korean irony, but I think what President Moon was especially pleased about was that the U.S. is serious about this issue, is trying to move ahead, and wants to be a good partner in the process.
Right. So if in terms of this the overview, if you could focus in on a highlight, it seems to me that you think just the overall tone was a highlight.
Yeah. Tone means a lot in summits, and often even more important than a joint statement. It's not so much the words, it's the music.
Right.
And I think the music was, worked very well between the two countries.
Right. Was there anything that you think was not adequately developed or omitted from the joint statement? Anything big?
I didn't see any real shortcoming there. I think it's clear the U.S. would like to see Japan and Korea work out a little better relationship than they've had. But, that I think is understood and didn't really need to be stated in any way.
Right. And again, going back to the press conference, I believe it was at the press conference that President Biden announced that the U.S. has appointed a Korea diplomat, Sung Kim, as a special envoy to the DPRK. I understand that Sung Kim very well.
Ambassador Kim is very well known to the Koreans, having been the U.S. ambassador there for 3 years. He's also very well known on the North Korean issue. During the six-party talks, he was my deputy as the head of he was the deputy head of our delegation. Went to North Korea on a number of occasions. Actually brought back some records from the North Koreans on the operating of the Yongbyon nuclear reactor. In one case, he was at the reactor, and he came back, and on his loafers, he had some fissile material, which good pair of loafers, but they nonetheless had to clean them up. So he knows the stuff from the ground up, and I think the Koreans appreciate that. There's not going to be any learning curve there. He's ready to roll. The question is not so much about ROK or the U.S. The question is, do the North Koreans want to do anything on this? I mean, do they accept the premise of the discussions, which is their denuclearization?
Right. Getting to the denuclearization, issue. Do you think that Sung Kim will be able to move this forward? He's former ambassador, very experienced with North Korea, as you just said. Does this suggest that we have somebody who's willing to just jump in right away? There's, as you said, no learning curve, and maybe
Yeah,
the North Koreans will change their mind and open
I don't
up?
think he'll jump in, but as I say, it takes two to tango. During my time, it took six to tango because we had a six-party talks. But I think the fact remains North Korea needs to make a decision. Are they going to be part of this or not? These have not been good days for North Korea. They've had a lot of a lot of problems in their economy. Kim Jong-Un has pretty much alluded to those very directly. So they have every reason to want to sit down and talk. I think the Biden administration has signaled that, look, we are talking denuclearization. We're not talking freezes and these various steps that the North Koreans hope will end up as an acceptance of them as a nuclear power. But I think they should also see in the Biden administration a more flexible approach to getting to the end game, which is denuclearization. And I think in having an experienced diplomat who's been up and down these hills before, he knows the terrain very well. And I think if there's anyone who can kind of pull this off and kind of get some momentum on this very crucial issue, I think it's Ambassador Sung Kim.
And President Moon, the South Koreans, they're totally in agreement with this ultimate policy objective, denuclearization. There's no gap between the two sides.
Yeah, there's no gap on what the end game should be. There might be gaps on how to approach it. And as we know, President Moon very much encouraged President Trump to get directly involved. Right. President Moon made kind of North Korea as his as a central issue. And for him, he kind of looks at it in the last few years, and it doesn't look like there's a lot of accomplishment. Now, he's not the only politician to look back at a North Korea policy and not see everything he wanted to see. So I think he was pleased to see a Biden administration that's willing to continue to work with him. And I don't think the Biden administration would be interested in criticizing him for going too fast or going too slow. I think the important thing in any alliance, and especially this one, is that there's adequate consultation. You don't have surprises. You don't have one side going off and doing something without the other side's knowledge about it and discussion. So I think in President Biden, he has a very straight-shooting interlocutor who is prepared to listen as much as to speak. And so I think from the Korean vantage point, this is pretty positive.
Right. In the press conference, President Biden was asked if there were any preconditions for a summit with Kim Jong-un. Has this been totally ruled out? Is President Moon still trying to get another summit arranged? Is there any hope for something like
certainly,
this?
I think it's fair to say President Moon was very supportive of President Trump meeting with Kim Jong-un. I think in the fullness of time, while that offered the promise of jump-starting a process that had been pretty moribund for some time, it may have offered that promise, but it sure did not deliver. So I think President Biden made it very clear he's not ruling out anything, but he made it clear we're not interested in reality TV, which to some extent our former president was kind of interested in the whole show of what happened in Singapore. I think President Biden will be much more focused on the results. And I think it's important not to rule things out in these kinds of fluid games, but at the same time, I think you need to be pretty realistic about what can be done. And I think what needs to be done now is a lot of work at lower levels of government.
Right. I note that President Biden has chosen Rahm Emanuel to be ambassador to Japan. But yet there's no chosen new ambassador for South Korea. Is there any significance to this?
Well, let me first say that there has been no announcement on any ambassadors, including Japan. That certainly has been in the press. I've seen it as you have.
These are press reports then?
Yes, these are press reports, so it hasn't been announced. So I suspect if that is announced, it'll be announced in the context of other ambassadorial assignments, and I'm sure Korea will be an early tranche. I don't know which tranche. It's kind of hard. Any incoming White House beset by crises, domestic and foreign policy, personnel choices are important. I
Right.
think they're vital in some cases, but it's not easy to find the time to go through these things and try to find the right people.
Right. Turning to there were a number of geostrategic issues that were brought up in the joint statement. The Quad, the Taiwan Straits, stability in the Taiwan Straits, uh, freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. What's Korea's position on this?
I think Korea, like many of us, shares a great concern about China and its willingness to live in a sort of rules-based
Right.
system. So I think Korea shares those concerns with us, and so I suspect that there was a real meeting of the minds about what the problems are. But I think in geopolitics, as in a lot of things, you stand, your stance may be where you sit. And so I think Korea looks over at China pretty close by and has to consider what the best way forward is in their relationship with China. And I think that's an example of something where you really need to have kind of a close understanding of each other's position. I'm not in a position to speak for Korea on, say, the Taiwan Straits, but certainly within the academic community, frankly, within the diplomatic, even military communities, there is concern that the sort of creative ambiguity that has served us well for many years, that somehow the deterrence that where the Chinese would say, we're not going to do that because we're really not sure what the U.S. would do in response. There's some concern that kind of paradigm has changed over the years. And I think, again, one thing the U.S. and ROK are in total alignment is they don't want any outbreak of hostilities over these kinds of issues. So I'm sure there was a real good discussion of this kind of question and the question of what will convince everyone to keep the status quo, which I think most people believe is better than any kind of unilateral change in that. Same with the South China Sea. Both Korea and the U.S. have a great interest in maritime freedom there. And the problem is China has not only been making facts on the ground, they've been making the ground itself by putting dirt in and military bases. And this is a real unilateral change in the issues. The Philippines has been very concerned about it. The other Southeast Asian nations have been concerned about it, and certainly Korea is. So the question is, what's the best way to calm this down and get things on a proper track? And I'm sure there's a lot of discussion on that.
Right. And then the question I wanted to wrap up with, but I think you've already answered it to a large degree. How do you assess the Biden administration's approach to South Korea so far? What has he done well, and what are the big or difficult challenges that lie ahead?
Well, it's quite a good ally of ours, the ROK. And I would argue from the ROK point of view, it's good to have a distant ally. The U.S. Has never had territorial interests in that part of the world. But I think from the South Korean perspective, it's good to see an interested ally, good to see that the U.S. really wants to continue this relationship. So I think the question is, where do we take it from here? There are a lot of technological issues being discussed. Chips, for example, which, as we know, these computer chips have had big supply chain issues with production of various things, including automobiles. So a lot of conversation about that sort of thing. I think the we have to look at the fruits of the whole Korea-U.S. trade agreement, make sure that's continuing to benefit both sides, which I think both sides are pleased with. But I think alliances of that age require work, and you have to keep at them. And I must say, I've worked with our allies in Europe. I've worked with our allies in a number of countries. I don't think we have a better ally than the Republic of Korea. And I think this meeting between our two presidents so early in our president's term, I think was really augurs well for the future of this.
Well, that's good to hear from the perspective of the Korea Society that we don't have a better ally than with the Republic
It's absolutely
of Korea.
true. It means I think you have a lot of good work to do, and maybe you don't have to worry about so many other things.
Well, as you said, you always have to maintain a good relationship and work at it. The last point you brought up, I mean, there is a KORUS free trade agreement, the Korea-U.S. free trade agreement. The acronym is KORUS, and in the joint statement there was a KORUS vaccine cooperation that was put out, and there's also the huge amount of pledged, if that's a proper word, Korean investment that will go into the U.S. The figure that I saw was $25 billion, which is enormous. The cumulative investment is $61 billion through 2019, so it's like 40% of what's come in historically. This will come in hopefully soon. This is a new area that seems to be opening up and developing, not just the U.S. technology, perhaps transfer, but production of vaccines abroad in Korea, and then the Koreans increasing their investments in perhaps chips to get around the supply chain blockages. So this is, I think, an area that we'll be watching in the future. It seems to be one that there'll be growth in.
I suspect the Koreans got a sense of our president the way many Americans have gotten a sense of him, which is he's not just interested in kind of going back to how things were earlier. He's really embraced the future. He certainly embraced this notion of this fourth industrial revolution. And, when you look at automobiles and you see the extraordinary importance of these batteries that could eventually have a big effect on just heating homes, just powering homes as well. And so we can already see some cooperation between U.S. firms and Korean firms on that. So I suspect this sort of new technological age that we live in, which our president's been kind of fascinated by, and you see this coming up a lot, not just when he was test driving that Ford 150 around the track, but you see this a lot with him. And I think the Koreans were probably kind of intrigued to hear the U.S. president talking in those terms. And so I think this all looks good for the complementary nature of our economy. So I'm not surprised to hear these ambitious investment numbers, because I think there's Korea is poised to get a big share of this future technology, and I think the U.S. is poised to do the same and to work with Korea.
Well, that's good. There'll be probably a lot of progress there. Most likely more progress there than on the North Korean front, at least in the
Yes, I think
years.
North Korea is the sort of hardy perennial. Every year we'll have a look at it sprouting up, and we'll have to decide what we're going to do about it. But seriously, North Korea this problem needs to be addressed. If North Korea gets away with having sort of a nuclear arsenal that it can, aim at us or aim at its neighbors, this is a very bad day, not just for the neighborhood, but for the rest of the world.
Right.
And my own view is this is not just a U.S. problem. It's certainly a South Korea problem, but it's a lot of other countries. And one of those countries that the U.S. and South Korea, I know they talked about, was the question of China and how China can be more helpful on this issue.
Right. Well, thanks for your time, Ambassador Hill, and welcome to the Korea Society's opening. This is our first in-person event since March 2020. It's been a long time coming, but thanks, and thanks for your all the work you do on the Korea Society board as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Hotez, thank you for joining the Korea Society in this post-summit session. And so my first question is, both Korea and the U.S. have agreed in their joint statement, the leaders' statement, to establish a global vaccine partnership. And this focuses on the global expansion of production and related materials, as well as scientific and technological cooperation. That's a quote from the statement. In fact, already the U.S. biotechnology firm Moderna and Samsung Biologics have announced a production deal. They announced that the day after the summit. And SK Biologics and the U.S. biotech firm Novavax announced a development and supply deal for an antigen component of the Novavax COVID vaccine that was done some time ago. So what do you see as the potential for such agreements to ramp up production and supply of vaccine in Korea in the near term?
Well, so this is one of the real strengths of ROK of South Korea and their ability to actually develop, produce, manufacture new vaccines. It may seem obvious that lots of countries should be able to do that. In fact, very few do that. And this is one of the great contributions that Korea makes for the world, that they've got a vaccine industry that punches above its weight in terms of a population, its size. And so Samsung, of course, Biologics has a lot of capacity. So does SK Biologics. There are several other Korean manufacturers. And I think this is an announcement that Korea is going to have a big footprint in shaping the COVID-19 vaccine ecosystem in terms of providing vaccines to the world and actually doing some innovation. So the first part of the global vaccine partnership is, it's somewhat modest. I mean, Samsung is, I don't know how much of that they're going to be actually involved in producing the mRNA vaccines from Moderna versus fill and finishing, but it's an important first step. And Novavax, I think vaccine, can be made by SK Biologics. But remember, there's so much more that Korea has to offer. For instance, the International Vaccine Institute, which was established in the 1990s as a global resource for basic vaccine R&D. That's, of course, headed by Dr. Jerome Kim. That provides also a lot of organization and technical know-how for the development of new vaccines that could partner with the Korean industry very well. And then, of course, there's the very innovative Korean Right Front, research innovation for global health technologies coming out of the Ministry of Health, which is fostering neglected disease technologies and including vaccines. So there's already a lot of things in place for this cooperative hub. And I think this is really the first big step, saying this is how we're going to begin shaping it and organizing it.
So this is another area where Korea can excel at, just like it's excelled in the production of semiconductor chips. Globally, it's one of the leaders.
Absolutely. The difference, though, is, Tom, is that there are not many countries that actually in Asia that have that capacity for developing vaccines. And, it's India, China, Indonesia to some extent, but Korea is an important player, and this is a global resource.
Right. My next question, a follow-on to that, was, how many of these cooperative hubs already exist outside of I don't know if you could call, outside of production in the U.S. and the EU? Do they exist anywhere yet? I guess where, a firm in the U.S. or the EU partners with a firm in some other country.
Yeah, there are not many, and there's an important group of vaccine producers which actually band together under this moniker of the Developing Country Vaccine Manufacturers Network, and I think it's really important that we fully tap that for COVID-19. India is probably one of the more well-developed in terms of producing vaccines at scale, because they have the Serum Institute of India and Biological E that we collaborate with, and Bharat Biotech. And then, so the BRICS countries seem to have some strength in this area. But we've got to expand it, because right now, for instance, no vaccines are made on the African continent. Which is pretty extraordinary. And Latin America profoundly underachieves. I mean, Brazil has some capacity, Cuba has some capacity, And then there are some of the Asian countries. The Middle East underperforms significantly. So this is, I think, one of the lessons learned from COVID-19, that we became too dependent on the big multinational
Right.
pharmaceutical companies, and some of them have stepped up and others haven't. And I think this is why we need Korea to make that contribution to that ecosystem.
Yeah. Well, actually, I lived in Singapore for a long time, and I know that the pharmaceutical industry is very big in Singapore. I'm actually surprised that they're not. I haven't read anything about them becoming a part of a cooperative hub. Is something in the works that I missed?
Yeah. So I think you brought up a really important point. So there are a number of countries that are good at small molecule drug pharmaceuticals and diagnostics are not necessarily in the vaccine space.
Right.
So Singapore has historically not been in the vaccine space, even though I think they have that capability. And I think that may be one of the big changes that you see coming out of post-pandemic is a lot of these countries are now going to recognize that they got caught short by not having that vaccine capability. And I think you're going to see a big expansion. I think the big question is, how do these countries now work together, whether it's through the G7 or the G20, to really build that vaccine development capacity in Africa? And it's not just, and the problem with vaccines is they're complicated. It's, if you have a small molecule, the structure of a small molecule, you usually can bring enough chemists around and formulation experts to produce that. Not so much with vaccines. And it's not even just the bricks and mortars of the factory. It's the human capital. It's the decades of knowledge that you need to actually produce vaccines at scale and do it under the right documentation system of batch production records and under quality control and quality assurance, and then have the national regulatory authority to know how to monitor. It's a very complicated situation, and not many countries know how to do that.
Yeah, the institutional capacity seems, I think, really overwhelming for a lot of countries in the developing world. One of the things that wasn't mentioned in the joint statement was the joint support for the WTO proposal, the initiative to increase global supply capacity through temporary patent waivers. I don't know where both. We know the Biden administration now seems to be supporting that. But perhaps one of the reasons it didn't come up because it was maybe too forward-looking, or the WT proposal, is not all-encompassing. If you just transfer a patent, it doesn't mean you could produce vaccines. Is that right?
Well, that's exactly right. As I said, if you know the structure of a small molecule drug, chances are you can bring enough organic chemists together and medicinal chemists to produce it. And the only thing standing in your way is the patent. That's not so much with the vaccine. I mean, for instance, our vaccine that we're scaling up production of, we haven't even filed patents on it because that's not the biggest barrier. I don't want to be too dismissive of patents. It's not that they don't have any role. It's just that in terms of this pandemic, over the next year or so, I don't see patents having a big impact one way or the other.
Okay, good. Well, not so good, but
because it's the technical. Now, what you really need, if you really want to make mRNA vaccines, what we need are the experts at Moderna and Pfizer and BioNTech to go into these countries and work with the scientists to actually build that capacity. So it's the trade secrets, it's the technical know-how that's the big barrier. And as I said, the training of the human capital is everything.
Yeah. And those vaccines have been the messenger RNA vaccines. They're like a decade in development. Is that right?
Or more than that. I mean, I remember, Margaret Liu and Jeff Ulmer back in the 90s, talking about DNA and nucleic acid vaccines and the way they were discovered. The problem was historically not only the scale up, but the fact that it was a problem. They worked well in laboratory animals and mice, for instance, but that those effects weren't reproducible in people. And I think that was the big breakthrough. And I was really pleased to see how quickly that accelerated in this pandemic.
Yeah. Okay. And then the last question I'd like to discuss with you, the last issue, is this idea of a vaccine swap. So this originally came up by South Korea's foreign minister, Jung, who, noting that Korea is facing delays in securing delivery of contracted vaccine allotments, but yet having a relatively low, actually a very low vaccination rate, one of the lowest in the OECD countries, I believe. So he thought maybe the U.S. is reaching an inflection point where supply exceeds demand, particularly as the vaccine producers ramp up production. So his idea was to the U.S. would give some of its vaccines to Korea, and eventually Korea, when the delivery is made, and Korea is over-ordered, way over-ordered its population needs. I think it ordered 192 million doses, would only for 99 million people or 90 million people, something like that. But the population is only 52 million. At any rate, this idea of a vaccine swap, it wasn't mentioned in the joint statement. However, the U.S. did agree to provide enough vaccine to inoculate 550,000 Korean military personnel who serve shoulder to shoulder with 28,500 American personnel stationed in Korea. But getting back to the vaccine swap, is this idea, has the U.S. entered into a vaccine swap with any other country that you know of? And what is the Biden administration's policy towards the global supply of vaccine, not just the bilateral supply of vaccine?
So in terms of swap, I know that the Biden administration has provided some doses to Mexico, which I believe is a loan. And the problem is this: the Biden administration has done an extraordinary job of vaccinating the American people and doing it with incredible speed and high level of integrity and safety. That's been fabulous. But what the Biden administration really hasn't done is articulate a comprehensive foreign policy for vaccines and vaccine diplomacy. What do I mean by that? When you look at the enormity of what's needed, more than 1 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa, 650 million people in Latin America, hundreds of millions of people in some of the smaller low-income countries of Asia. When you add that all up, that's 2 to 3 billion people. You're talking about 5 to 6 billion doses of vaccine. Where is that going to come from? The mRNA technology is very exciting. I got the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, and I'm grateful for it. But it's still a relatively new technology, and like any new technology, producing it at scale, there's a learning curve, and eventually that'll be figured out to do it at very high throughput ways, but not right away. So what's the plan? What's the plan for the Biden administration to start really looking at how we're going to provide 5 to 6 billion doses of vaccines for the world? And that's what's missing right now. We're sort of getting these kind of one-off things, maybe a swap with Korea, some patent waivers, donating, 60 million doses of excess AstraZeneca vaccine. That's fine, but ultimately it's a drop in the bucket. It's very modest compared to what's needed. So what I'm looking for from the Biden administration is I'd like to see the Secretary of State get up there and give an hour-long foreign policy speech for vaccine diplomacy. What's the plan? How are we going to vaccinate, provide 5 to 6 billion doses between now and the end of the year, which is what we have to do? Who's going to manufacture that? Who's going to pay for that? Now, maybe it doesn't have to be the United States alone. It probably shouldn't be, but I think this is where we need the U.S. government to step up and provide some leadership. And then over the long term, how are we going to build vaccine development capacity so Africa does have the ability to make its own vaccines, and Latin America, elsewhere in Asia and the Middle East? And how are we going to provide the regulatory science, the national regulatory authorities like the FDA, because we've learned that's so important in terms of pharmacovigilance and monitoring. And so that's what needs to be put in place. And for some reason, they've kind of kept that at arm's length so far. And I understand it's a new administration still, and they've got a lot on their plate with vaccinating the U.S. population and what's going on now in the Middle East, but that's got to happen sooner rather than later.
And I guess the U.S. has to take the leadership role in here, because the U.S. is the leading global vaccine power in the world. Is that right?
Well, we've always relied on the U.S. to some extent to provide leadership in global health. I mean, whether it was for HIV/AIDS and President George W. Bush stepping up to create PEPFAR, the President's emergency plan for AIDS relief, and the global health security agenda, and the Obama administration around H1N1, and then I served as U.S. science envoy in the Obama administration.
Right.
For that very important program when President Obama went to Cairo in 2009 and made that new beginning speech about reaching out to the Muslim world in the arts and sciences. So we need something of that caliber right now, and I think the sooner that happens, the better. The U.S. can't go it alone, but I think until the U.S. takes a step forward and provides that leadership, it's not going to happen either.
Right. Well, that's yeah. This is certainly extreme times, and we need somebody to step up and take the leadership. And these issues transcend the bilateral relationship; they're global. So I'm glad you pointed that out and put down that challenge.
I think Korea has the capacity to be a terrific partner.
Yeah,
because Korea, as I say, it's got a lot of horsepower for vaccine development, not only in terms of manufacturing, but organizations like IVI that can provide a lot of that intellectual framework. And so there's a lot. Korea's got a lot of important things going for it.
Yeah. Well, hopefully then this vaccine partnership between Korea and the U.S. can evolve into a global vaccine partnership and help contribute to the global need for more SARS-2 vaccines.
Well, it gets back to the founding of IVI, the International Vaccine Institute, in the 1990s. I went when I heard about it. I made a specific. At that time, I was doing a lot of work in China on parasitic disease, and I made a point to visit the IVI because it was founded under, with very idealistic intentions. People like Gurinder Shahi and Richard Mahoney, and this is the kind of international organization we need to help provide some of the glue to bring some of those things together.
We had I interviewed the Director General, Dr. Jerome Kim, just a couple of weeks ago about this. So if anyone wants to learn more about the IVI, other than going on Google, you could listen to one of the Korea Society programs. All very important, very timely, very urgent needs. So thank you, Dr. Hotez, for joining the Korea Society this afternoon.
Well, thank you, and thanks for giving attention to these. These are very important issues.
Right. Thanks again.